April 1st, 1945, Okinawa, Japan. The first assault waves of the 1st Marine Division and 6th Marine Division come ashore under a grey ceiling of cloud and smoke. Boots slipping on coral rubble as Higgins boats back away, and the beach fills with men, crates, and the flat bark of automatic fire. Among the rifles and carbines are short, blunt, pump-action shotguns with perforated steel handguards and a bayonet lug that looks oversized for the barrel. Each tube magazine holds 5 shells, each shell filled with 9 pellets of Uno buckshot. And every pellet carries the energy to end a fight at the distance of a small room. This weapon is the Winchester Model 12 in its trench gun configuration. And on this ground, its role is brutally simple. Clear whatever the artillery and flamethrowers have missed. The thesis of this episode is direct. In the Pacific, Japanese planners treated the shotgun as a sporting arm with no strategic consequence. Once combat forced them to handle captured trench guns and to see what a trained Marine could do with one at close range. That assumption collapsed. The Model 12's mechanical traits: short overall length, a heat shield that keeps a hot barrel grippable, a bayonet mounting that turns a doorbuster into a pike in tight tunnels, and a trigger group without a disconnector that allows controlled slam fire, gave American units a repeatable advantage in the single most decisive micro-environment of the island war. The last 10 meters. From this landing, we will step back to the doctrine that underestimated this class of weapon. Show where and how shotguns were actually issued and used. Measure their effect in rates and distances that matter. And track how Japanese units reacted when the weapon they had dismissed appeared at the mouths of caves and inside fighting pits. Then we will follow the consequences through Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, where caves and reinforced positions turned close combat from an occasional risk into the routine task of taking ground. The U.S. Marine Corps entered the Pacific with institutional memory of trench fighting and riot control. And that memory came with hardware. The World War I lineage of the trench gun led to 2 main pump actions in World War II. The older Winchester Model 1897 and the sleeker Winchester Model 12, standardized as a compact fighting gun with a 20-inch barrel, ventilated handguard and bayonet adapter for the M1917 blade. By 1942, production details had shifted. The wartime heat shield typically showed 4 rows of cooling holes rather than the earlier 6, but the essentials were the same. 5 shells in the magazine, a 6th in the chamber if needed, and an action that cycled as fast as a trained hand could run the forend. The lack of a disconnector meant that if the shooter held the trigger back and worked the slide, the gun would fire each time the bolt locked, slam fire making a designed cadence of measured, aimed pairs, and triples in spaces where a rifle's extra reach conferred no advantage. Marines did not call it a wonder weapon. They called it the right tool for short distances. That distinction mattered because the island terrain made short distance the default. The Japanese garrison plan on most islands reached its mature form by late 1943. Fight from caves, counterpunch with infiltration, preserve combat power by avoiding annihilation on the beaches, and bleed the attacker day after day from prepared positions. Caves presented 3 problems at once: a frontal aperture too small to offer a target for light artillery, a layered interior that let a defender survive, blast and return fire, and a geometry that collapsed long sightlines into a grab for the nearest angle. In that geometry, the severe fall-off of buckshot beyond roughly 20 to 25 yards did not matter. What mattered was what happened inside a corridor, a bunker room, a traverse in a trench, 9 pellets striking like simultaneous pistol shots into a shape-sized target, with the first 2 shells often deciding the contest. The numbers anchored the claim. A Marine with a Model 12 carried 5 rounds in the tube, and, typically, a bandolier or grenade vest repurposed to hold 25 to 40 additional shells. Buckshot patterns from a 20-inch cylinder bore spread on the order of a few inches per yard in practical conditions. At 10 yards, a 9-pellet 00 buck load presented a dense, fist-sized cluster that punished any exposure. The museum training tables that conservatively gave an effective range of a couple dozen yards for the fighting shotgun were not. Dismissing the gun, they were instructing Marines to use it where it counted. And used correctly, cadence beat reaction. A trained operator could deliver 2 aimed shots in about a second and a half. Cycle a third on the pump stroke, and transition to the bayonet or the butt in a heartbeat. That mechanical cycle mapped directly to the distances in a cave or trench turn. Japanese officers, whose pre-war training emphasized bayonet drill, fire discipline, and maneuver in small groups, had reasons to discount a shotgun on paper. Imperial Japanese Army small arms doctrine prioritized rifles and light machine guns, concentrated on marksmanship and fire control, and treated buckshot as an unsoldierly scattering of lead, without reach. Early war tables of equipment did not include a Japanese equivalent of a military trench shotgun. American use of shotguns had been controversial even in 1918. Germany had protested their use in the trenches of France, and the absence of a domestic precedent shaped a bias. The shotgun was for hunting, riot duty, or police. Serious infantry used rifles. That cultural and doctrinal lens helps explain the initial Japanese indifference to Allied shotguns captured in the Philippines and the Solomons. Captured materiel was routinely logged and forwarded for intelligence summaries. Rifles, carbines, submachine guns, and bazookas drew detailed attention because they were either broadly useful or utterly novel. The shotgun fell between categories: familiar as a civilian object, unfamiliar as a standardized military tool. On Guadalcanal and New Georgia, Marines and soldiers nonetheless learned fast where the pump gun mattered. A typical squad-level application emerged and repeated. A base of fire with rifles and a Browning automatic rifle locked a position. A flamethrower or satchel charge prepared the entry, and a 2-man shotgun element went forward to clear the living space created by blast. In that narrow space, the Model 12's slamfire let the point man dictate the first half-second. If a defender lurked just inside an aperture, a mouse hole between caves, a trench firing slit the first shot was enough. If the angle hit a second man behind the first, the second shell in the same sight picture landed before the defender's reaction overcame blast, light loss, and shock. The third shot was rare, not because the gun lacked speed, but because the fight was decided by then. The cave systems at Peleliu turned this tactic from an occasional solution into a schedule. The ridge systems Umerbrugel especially were honeycomb. Japanese defenders fought from concrete tree-enforced openings sited to interlock with enfilade, and small counterattacks tried to retake galleries lost to flamethrower and demolitions teams. The Marine problem was not finding the enemy, but entering rooms he could reoccupy within minutes. Shotguns were one of the few tools that allowed immediate, precise, lethal force at the step-in distance without endangering the Marine immediately behind the muzzle with ricochet or over-penetration. Rifle fire in a cave sends supersonic spall off rock. Buckshot does too, but over a dramatically shorter path and with less unpredictable rebound. For Marines who measured their chances in seconds and steps, the shotgun's bounded risk and controlled burst density made it a confidence weapon. It is here that Japanese assessments began to shift from casual to specific. Reports captured by US intelligence agencies late in the war included repeated references to American short-barreled guns used in assaults on cave positions and trench traverses, often paired with the observation that these guns were fired rapidly in conjunction with grenades and flame. The Japanese did not invent euphemisms for the experience. The language was matter-of-fact, focused on the effect and the counter. The proposed counters were predictable: deeper internal blast walls, a second firing chamber offset from the entrance, overlapping fields of fire from apertures at different heights, and, when possible, a simple expedient wire and brush at the entry lip to snag a bayonet or the barrel of a short gun. None of these neutralized the first shot problem. Once American units moved from reducing caves with field pieces to entering them as a matter of course, the contest was about the first beat of violence inside the opening. The Model 12 was made for that beat. Because the shotgun lacks rifle precision beyond short stretches, it invites myths that cloud its real contribution. One myth is that Marines sprayed vaguely in a general direction and trusted the spread. They did not. Accounts from squad leaders emphasize aiming high on a shape and working down. sending the first shot to eyes and hands, the second to center mass, and then dropping the muzzle to check corners. Another myth is that the shotgun's limited range made it a niche tool that could be replaced by submachine guns. In practice, the .45 ACP from a Thompson or M3 bounces around stone and coral, with irregular behavior and a longer hazard distance than buckshot. The shotgun put more pellets in a hand-sized circle at 10 yards than a burst of .45 could deliver into an equivalent area in that same second. The bloodless proof is in training metrics, at room-scale distances. Hit probability per trigger pull with a shotgun exceeds that of a submachine gun by a wide margin, especially for the first 2 shots. Japanese forces did use captured weapons when logistics allowed light rifles, carbines, and even machine guns turn up in photographs and reports. But shotguns seldom appeared in sustained Japanese service for simple reasons. Ammunition supply was fragile for everything, and 12-gauge shells were not a stock item in Japanese depots. A weapon without a reliable feed stream becomes a curiosity, not a capability. What Japanese units did do, particularly on Bougainville and later in the Marianas and Volcano Islands, was to examine captured American trench guns and incorporate what they had learned into defensive microdesign. They thickened blind corners. They cut additional murder holes, so the first aperture a Marine reached was not the only source of fire. They rehearsed counterattack drills into galleries that had just been cleared. Betting on the fatigue of American assault teams, those changes acknowledged the shotgun even when they did not name it. Close combat is most honest when reduced to seconds, and so are the costs. Shotguns did not make caves safe. They made caves more survivable to enter. A Marine with a Model 12 still stepped into darkness against men who had chosen their ground and wired it to their advantage. The American response was combined arms at pocket scale, a flame jet to drive men away from the aperture and reduce oxygen, demolition to distort interior geometry, and, in the second breath, a shotgun to settle the outcome at the distance of an arm span. The Model 12's bayonet an M1917. Blade longer than the space between forearm and muzzle mattered, more often than outsiders expect. If a defender tried to trap the barrel with wire or rope, a trained Marine cut or shoved through. If a defender closed to grapple, the shotgun handled like a club that still held a trigger, and in the crush the ability to fire during a pump stroke was not a theoretical trait. It made the difference between having to find the trigger reset and simply running. The action while the sights remained indexed on a chest. On Okinawa, the geography that had punished every earlier landing reappeared larger. Caves, honeycombed, Shuri Ridge, and its approaches with angles designed to negate long-range fire. The Model 12 moved in staff's notes from specialty issue to routine presence in assault teams because the tasks had normalized. Move, reduce, enter, clear, hold. Numbers at the theater level rarely capture that rhythm, but unit-level reports do. In battalions that tracked their small arms mix, shotguns were a tiny percentage of total long guns, but they featured in a large share of recorded room entry actions. A weapon issued by the dozens altered the outcomes of actions counted in hundreds, because those actions always ended in the same confined space. For Japanese soldiers who approached the war with a faith in morale, shock, and the rifleman's virtues, the shotgun was not terrifying because it was exotic, but because it was implacably practical. It was American in the most frustrating sense, an industrial product adapted to a specific job and issued to the men who had to do it. When Japanese troops handled a captured Model 12, they discovered nothing mystical, no secret cartridge, no trick sight, but they could feel the weight distribution that made it controllable in one hand. The handguard that let them grip a barrel that had just sent 3 shells in a second, and the trigger that broke again the instant the action closed. A single infantry company might have possessed only a few of these. But on the days and in the places where caves and trench lines decided everything, those few shaped whether a position fell now or after another morning of fire and blood. The moral dimension hangs over these facts and must be faced. Buckshot at room distance is not a clean instrument. It does what it is made to do, with an efficiency that leaves little room for surrender at the doorway. American units adapted their tactics to minimize unnecessary killing loud warning. Flame to drive defenders away from apertures. Loud hailers, when practical, but, in many systems of tunnels, surrender was functionally impossible. Japanese doctrine and command pressure made capture rare. In that terrible environment, the shotgun was a tool for ending fights under control, rather than letting them sprawl into the larger system where grenades and ricochets on both sides killed men who no longer had a say in the outcome. The lesson that emerges at this halfway point of the story is not that the Model 12 won battles alone. It is narrower, and therefore stronger. When the tactical problem compresses to a few paces, design details decide. A heat shield that saves a burned hand keeps the gun in the fight. A bayonet lug that holds a long, stiff blade keeps the barrel from being trapped. A trigger group without a disconnector keeps a trained operator ahead of his opponent by a fraction of a second in the first, only relevant exchange. Japanese officers, who called it just a shotgun, had to revise their view once caves and trenches taught them the real unit of measure in that war's last steps, the doorway. That revision did not change the outcome on Okinawa. It did change how defenders built the next doorway, and how the attackers prepared to meet it. In late 1943, on Bougainville, an ordnance detachment attached to a Japanese infantry regiment examined a cache of American weapons captured after a night infiltration went wrong near a coconut grove. Among M1 rifles, carbines, and a scorched flamethrower canister lay a short, parkerized pump gun with a barrel shroud and an unfamiliar bayonet lug. The notes made by that detachment, later recovered by Allied intelligence, described it clinically as a short, smoothbore repeating gun with 5-round magazine and a device to fix a long knife. The men who handled it tested cycling with dummy rounds, remarked on the lack of a trigger reset between shots if the trigger was held to the rear, and tried the weapon in a shallow trench they had dug behind their lines. The test was not elaborate. It did not need to be. At 10 to 15 paces, the pellets tore palm fronds and split bamboo stakes with a pattern that clustered tighter than they expected. And the rhythm of fireclack of the pump, immediate detonation, was faster than any repeater in their inventory. The report's conclusion was not that this was a war winner. It was that the Americans had a gun purpose-built for the violent moment in a confined space. Within weeks, field orders in that sector advised cutting additional apertures and using overhead fire to cover tunnel mouths, measures that addressed the threat without naming it. The Bougainville vignette is not an isolated curiosity. It is a representative moment in a long accumulation of contact lessons. Tarawa, in November 1943, had already demonstrated how a short gun fit the pace of reducing bunkers under observation. There, Marines discovered that the most valuable seconds came after an explosion, when smoke and dust concealed both sides from each other and shock might last longer than a single breath. A Model 12 in that breath converted surprise into control. The technique repeated island after island. Assault teams learned to treat the first 2 shells as a single, decisive action, and the rest of the magazine as insurance against a hidden turn, a back room, or a countercharge. Japanese units watching from adjacent positions could not fail to notice that the teams who entered did not linger, exposed at the door. They flowed through. The gun was part of that flow. Iwo Jima, in February 1945, put this logic under the heaviest pressure of the Pacific War. The island's volcanic ash and hardened defenses multiplied the difficulty of every step. The defenders' use of deep galleries and interlocked fields of fire from the slopes of Suribachi and the northern plateaus made rifle marksmanship a preparation rather than a decision point. The decision point still happened inside the openings. Demolition and flame were essential to make entry survivable. The Model 12 finished what they started. Unit records from assault engineer platoons mentioned the pump gun in the same dry matter-of-fact tone they used for satchel charges and flamethrowers. It was equipment for a defined task whose importance could be expressed in minutes saved, casualties avoided, and positions that did not have to be retaken tomorrow. In the small rooms of Iwo Range collapsed to the kind of measures a man can step. A Marine who practiced the gun's manual of arms until it emptied under control in 2.5 to 3 seconds, could take a right-angled turn with the confidence that a defender, still regaining his senses, could not interpose a shot in that window. A rifle fired that quickly inside stone punishes everyone with noise, pressure, and fragments. A shotgun's pellets lose energy fast, and don't slice back off rock with the same unpredictable violence. That bounded risk mattered when the second man in the stack was close enough to feel the muzzle blast on the back of his neck. None of this means the shotgun replaced other tools. It coexisted with the Thompson and the M3, and with the carbine that many Marines preferred for general use. Each weapon's behavior, in stone and coral, sorted itself into jobs as surely as water finds a path downhill. The shotgun was the one you wanted when the path ended at a doorway you had to cross. Numbers on paper hardened into behavior. A typical buckshot load of 900 pellets, roughly 490 grains total, exiting at about 1,250 feet per second from a 20-inch barrel. Strikes at 10 yards with a dense cluster that can be kept on a chest-sized target, shot after shot. 3 such shells, spaced half a second apart, deliver more than a dozen impacts into a palm's breadth on a human target before he has processed the first. On the receiving end, that is not a comparison to a pistol. It is a terminal event, and in a tunnel, the volume of air and the acoustics amplify the shock into a paralysis that the second man in the stack uses to move or to post. Japanese soldiers who captured a Model 12 and tried it could feel the cadence, even if they lacked ammunition for sustained training. They could also see what was different from the shotguns they knew from civilian life. The heat shield with 4 rows of holes was not ornament. After a magazine dumped in seconds, the guard kept hands from skin burn that would otherwise force a pause. The bayonet lug was not a sentimental link to earlier wars. In a narrow entrance, where a defender might try to trap a barrel with a loop of wire or to rush a muzzle, a long, rigid blade changed the physics. The lack of a trigger disconnector was not a corner cut. It was a deliberate choice that rewarded discipline and made the first exchange faster for the man who had trained. Doctrine on both sides advanced in response to facts. Japanese officers emphasized camouflage of apertures, elevation differences to defeat low-angle fire, interior blast baffles, and rehearsed counterattacks timed to catch American teams reloading or rotating. American battalions adjusted by splitting tasks among pairs, by catching ammunition just short of the entry line, by pairing the shotgun with a partner carrying a carbine to handle a longer sight line immediately beyond the first room, and by refining signal short taps on the helmet, light touches on the shoulders so that the gun's thunder did not drown communication. In that push and countermove, the Model 12 remained what it had been from the start, a specialized, reliable tool for solving a recurring problem. Okinawa brought the problem to its largest scale. The fighting around Shuri, Sugarloaf, and other ridges demanded repetitive, punishing work day after day against an opponent who had perfected defense in depth. Cave complexes there were not just shelters. They were weapon systems with apertures tuned to make any approach a gauntlet. Here, the measure is not the number of shotguns issued, but the tasks logged. An assault company might have a handful of Model 12s at the line each day, rotating among teams. Those guns would feature in dozens of entries a day across the company's sector. If each entry prevented 1 grenade from being thrown back or 1 countercharge from getting started, the marginal advantage compounded into lives kept and ground held. That is how tools justify themselves in war, not in spectacle, but in accumulation. Evidence from the Japanese side arrives in fragments, but points the same direction. Intelligence summaries captured in 1944 and 1945 refer to American short-barreled repeaters fired very rapidly, often in the second or two after blasting or flaming an entrance, and 2 American bayonet thrusts that followed a pair of shots immediately. The recommended responses: sketch an enemy scene up close, aim high into the doorway from an offset hole, use obstacles to trap the first man's weapon, and be ready to fire into the second man before the first can clear. These recommendations are the mirror image of American drills. Each side could see the other's motions because the space between them was a few paces wide. Material constraints kept the shotgun a largely American signature in the Pacific. The United States could move pallets of 12-gauge shells to islands the Navy owned. Japan could not push bespoke ammunition to every cavern it defended, and improvising buckshot loads in combat conditions was not a sustainable path to capability. Where Japanese troops did integrate captured pump guns for a few days, the result was usually an ambush that ended when the last shells fired. The practical lesson they drew was not to adopt the shotgun en masse, but to shape entry conditions that denied the Americans those first easy pairs. Even there, the geometry of caves and trenches meant the American pair of shots remained a fixture of the fight. Some controversies survive in the literature and deserve the seal of honesty. One concerns the exact proportion of Model 12s versus Model 97s in particular battles. Ordnance, records and photos vary across units and months, and totals by theater sometimes disagree. Another concerns the range at which buckshot patterns remain decisively dense. Test protocols, shell construction, and barrel wear all alter outcomes, and contemporary accounts speak in useful but broad terms: room distance, tunnel distance, across the trench rather than yards and inches. These variations do not alter the operational point. Whether a particular team carried 1897s or 12s, whether their patterns opened a hair more or less at 12 yards, their job and their cadence were the same: burst, entry, a pair of aimed shots, a check of corners, a shove to the next angle. The Model 12's production story also anchors its presence. Wartime contracts put tens of thousands of trench and riot configurations into service across the Marine Corps, Army, and Navy for guard duty, ship security, and field issue. In the Pacific, the competition for space on a landing craft and 4 ounces on a man's shoulders meant every weapon had to earn its keep. The Model 12 did so where nothing else quite matched its mix of control, power, and compactness. Its slamfire became a hallmark of training. Recruits learned to keep the forend moving, to ride the recoil back into the pump stroke, and to avoid outrunning the action. The pace was not frantic. It was metronomic. See, press, cycle, see again. That rhythm persisted in veterans' memories because it belonged to the seconds that made the difference. By the time the last island fights ground down in mid-1945, both sides had completed the same spiral of adaptation from opposite poles. What had begun as a doctrinal blind spot for the defenders, the assumption that a shotgun was a crude, sporting piece with little military use, did as a hard instruction written in the walls of caves and the corners of trenches: prepare for a fast, heavy hit inside the doorway. The American view moved in the other direction, from institutional memory of trench guns to a rediscovery of their exact job in the Pacific. Neither view attributed magic to metal. Each recognized that when terrain collapses range, engineering details create margin. The Winchester Model 12's details paid rent every day. Beyond the Pacific, the gun's legacy traveled oddly straight. Post-war police agencies embraced the pump shotgun for the same reasons Marines had trusted it: control at close range, quick follow-up shots, and a pattern that punishes hesitation without endangering neighbors beyond a wall the way a rifle bullet might. Militaries kept shotguns in inventories for guard work, breaching, and niche combat roles. When later designs added disconnectors to satisfy safety codes, the old slamfire guns became minor legends, prized by men who had felt time compress and wanted every fraction of a second in their hands. The larger lesson is not nostalgic. It points forward to how forces should treat out-of-fashion tools. New weapons and doctrines capture attention, but wars are decided as often by how well a force matches tools to the smallest decisive tasks as by glamorous leaps. In the Pacific, the decisive task at human scale was crossing thresholds into spaces set up to kill intruders. The Model 12 did not remove the risk. It narrowed the window in which risk could turn into loss. Japanese soldiers who initially dismissed it as just a shotgun learned through contact that some tools, because they are plain and focused, alter behavior more than their size suggests. Their captured tests, their field orders to alter apertures and add obstacles, and their rehearsed counterattacks all marked a quiet respect. Respect did not equal adoption because logistics forbade it, but respect bent defenses, and bending defenses is an admission in steel. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the inventories and after-action reports told the story in their own blunt way. Shotguns had been a small portion of American long guns in the Pacific. but a large portion of the weapons recorded in cave and trench entries. That disproportion is the sign of a tool used exactly where it mattered. The Japanese experience, pieced together from fragments of captured paperwork and the testimony of men who faced those entries, confirms the other side of the same truth. They met a gun they thought they understood from peacetime, and discovered they had misjudged what it does to the pulse and the geometry of a fight at arm's length. The final measure of the Model 12's role is not a myth of fearful enemies or of single-handed triumphs, but the steady record of rooms taken on the first try, of tunnels not retaken by night, and of squads that came back with one more man than they would have without that pair of shots at the threshold. That is the kind of arithmetic that ends wars faster and saves lives invisibly. It is not glamorous, but it is the kind of truth practitioners remember. A last word belongs to the operational thesis we began with on the beaches of Okinawa. A weapon dismissed in doctrine as a civilian arm proved, in a war of caves and corners, to be a precision instrument for the last 10 meters. The men who carried it did not romanticize it. They learned its weight, its recoil, its peculiarities, and they brought it to the door first, because the door was the true front line. Their opponents, who captured, cycled, and test-fired the same gun, learned enough from the pattern on bamboo and the cadence of slam-fire to redesign doorways. Those redesigned doorways could delay defeat. They could not cancel the seconds a practiced hand bought with steel and discipline. That is the Model 12's historical footprint in the Pacific. A small count on the books, a large share of decisions where the path narrowed to a human frame, and a lesson about humility in weapon judgment that outlived the war itself. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.